Tonight, we are going to take on another big genre of learning. We're going to take on Jewish philosophy and Jewish ethics. Jewish ethics and Jewish philosophy. This is outside the system of law. If you remember, the Talmud and the Midrash are a great big repository of Jewish law, of opinions on Jewish law, discussions on Jewish law. But they also are a great big repository of stories of the Torah, interpretations of the stories, values, ethics. There's a tractate of the Mishnah called Ethics of Our Fathers, which is all about living beyond the letter of the law. There's the letter of the law in Judaism, and there's the spirit of the law, but then there is the idea of holiness. How do I become better? How do I move up the ladder? The Torah tells us, you shall do that which is right and good. We should understand that to mean that beyond the letter of the law, you have to use your own seichel, you have to use your own head, you have to use your own heart to go beyond the letter of the law. But this is very subjective, because what is beyond what is relevant for one person might not be for another. The idea of spiritual growth, how do I become a better person, a more feeling person, a more caring person, a more holy person? It's an unlimited journey. So in truth, this class really, the next two classes, this class and tomorrow and next week, is really the theology of Judaism, or I'll call it the theologies of Judaism. And really, it should be 4 separate classes, or maybe even one class going chronologically for 4 weeks, because we're going to deal with overlapping theologies of Judaism that coexist at the same time, but we're going to separate them and put them into these compartments and boxes that they don't really fit into. They burst at the seams. So the first one that I want to talk about is, for a moment, a little more about this ethics element. Ethics of Our Fathers is this idea of going beyond the letter of the law, and about it creates a continuation of genres of Jewish learning that promote holiness, promote ultimately reaching a level of prophecy. In other words, how do you reach this level of complete cleaving and oneness with the divine? That's going to be a little bit more in the Kabbalistic literature, which we're not talking about tonight, but it exists already in the moral literature of how one rises above their own selfish, self-centered self. Okay, but we're going to start with, and I think we're going to focus most of our time on philosophy. Philosophy is a fascinating challenge in Judaism, and I believe it has a very important message for us today, as we in our world, as we are in the Western world. So let's take a quick look at why is ethics and why is theology important in Judaism? It's not law. It has relevance to law. And the same thing with ethics and morals that go beyond the letter of the law. There's a famous expression that a person can be a lowlife within the letter of the law. You can follow Jewish law and find loopholes that will allow you to be a legal person, but you're not a good person. In other words, you could be smarter, so to speak, and find ways to circumvent the system. I'm not going to give anyone any ideas, but there's always ways to circumvent. So we say there's a necessity of also being transformed within. So let's this is a quick overview. Torah seems to focus primarily on our behavior and less on how we think and feel. However, Torah is a holistic guide, it's not just behavior. The fact is, and feel free to interject, many people will recognize that Judaism is more a religion of deed than creed. It's more about what you do than what you think. It's more in general, and Jewish law contributes to that. In other words, you can have a lack of consensus in Jewish theology in the Talmud. If someone says, what did the sages of the Talmud believe? Well, there are many different sages, and they say many different things. Reward and punishment. There are different approaches. It's not harmonized. They don't even attempt to make a harmony. It is in the later period, in this period that we're going to talk about, from the year 800, 900 on, where there's an attempt to create a philosophy of Judaism, which was similar to what they did with Jewish law, but Jewish law, there always was that urge to know how to behave. There was less of an urge to know what to believe. There are a multiplicity of different approaches in the Talmud and Midrashim. Of course, there were parameters that we call, oh, this person's a heretic. Okay, there are red lines. What those red lines are, we can discuss. But the whole general view, what exactly are angels? What exactly are miracles in the Torah? What exactly does it mean to believe God is one? All these type of discussions in an organized form is much more the realm of Jewish philosophy that develops in that later period. Okay, so there are mitzvot that are given over to the emotions. Love your neighbor. If it doesn't just mean behave nicely to the person as if you love them, but it actually means have emotions towards others. So that's an internal change. It's not just an action change. There's this idea of refining oneself that you could, legally from the letter of law, you can have a gold toilet seat. But it's not exactly the refinement that Judaism wants. Okay, where do we find this from? Where do we find this sensitivity? Where does it come from and how can we develop it and make it part of our life? Not to be ostentatious consumption, conspicuous consumption, to live a life of meaning and purpose outside of just law, because it is a danger, so to speak. Okay. And then there are other things which are traits of joy and trust. Even in Jewish law, you do find some of these fundamentals are put into Jewish law because some of them are seen as very basic types of values that one has to try to make part of their life because it's intertwined with law. So it's not yet, this is not yet talking about these special, unique works which become works of ethics. So part of that is the idea, though, of transforming oneself. And this is the idea of growing as a person. Okay. Now, some mitzvot, as far as reason, logic, and true belief, some mitzvot, shalom, shalom, some mitzvot require rational understanding to fulfill them properly. Okay, so just to unite these two fields, and then we'll jump in. This is more of the intro. Just to unite these two fields is that by having proper beliefs and true beliefs, that helps us in the effort to transform our emotions and character. When we understand how God provides for us, and we understand how everything happens for a reason, when we understand that no one bruises their finger down here unless it's been decreed on high, that's going to change my attitude towards somebody who cuts me off in traffic. In other words, if I believe that, if I think that, so here's the question: do I change my behavior and do I change my feelings through my mind by proper beliefs, or do I change my feelings by proper behavior? Jewish law will tell you by proper behavior, you're going to change your emotions too. If you give charity every day, you're going to become a charitable person. Every day you put money in that pushkin and you give it to poor people. Every day you're training your body and our hearts follow our action. That's what Jewish law will say. Jewish philosophy will say it's not just that, but having the right ideas will change my emotions too. By thinking properly about things, if I look at the guy who just cut me off in traffic and say he must be a messenger from God for some reason, I will not extend the universal sign of greeting or anything of that sort, or even lean on the horn or something. I'm not. It's meant to be. Why? Because my attitude will change my emotions. Okay. So here's the big problem, the big challenge. Work of philosophy, Chakira. This is a big issue. Why is this a big issue? It's a big issue because, the Hanukkah story? The Hanukkah story, we had a problem. There were Greeks. There were Greeks in the land. And the Greeks were trying to promote their way of life, which included idol worship. And Jews were following them. Stands up Yehuda Maccabee and his father and his brothers, and they fight back and they get their independence. The Jewish people and that period and afterwards throughout the Talmud were not enamored with Greek philosophy. You don't find in the Talmud, they speak to the sages of Athens, there's conversations at times, but they're not engaged. That's not their world. Their world is a organic Torah life in the land of Israel, influenced by their own surroundings, growing organically. Historians and academics try to find, where was there some influence on the Jewish communities in Babylon from the Persians or in Israel from their neighbors, the Greeks? But there's really, really not much. You want to see interaction, you want to see influence. The story of Jewish philosophy is that all of a sudden the Jews adopt whole hog. Matisyahu of the Maccabee fame should excuse the expression, Greek philosophy. How does this happen? And they integrate it into Judaism. We were talking till now how Judaism has streams of tradition, and we maintain it, and we hold on to it, and we treasure it, and we keep it, and we're so careful. But there's an encounter with the outside world which changes the flow of the stream, and it becomes a difficult conversation that goes on till today. Here's the timeline. I think this is a different, you can look in your book for the proper timeline. Okay, but there's in the book, I think it's 194, there's a map of the major works of Musar and philosophy. It is page, let's see, maybe before that.
192.
192, very good. This gives you an idea of major works. Now, Jewish philosophy is on the bottom, primarily taking place in Sephardic lands. And there's a historical reason for this. Is going to be an interesting Sfard-Ashkenaz divide, both because of external reasons and internal reasons. So a very quick overview. The Jews of Ashkenaz, they came from Italy. They come through either from Babylon first or Israel first, wherever it is, through Italy. They become communities in France and Germany. Rashi and Rashi's grandchildren are the parents of that community. And then after the Black Death, when this community in the 1300s goes to Poland, the Jews of Poland, Russia, Western and Eastern Europe are pretty much all Ashkenazim. That's the Ashkenazi world of today. And we are primarily in America descendants of those people. Those people lived in their own communities. The peasants and the non-Jews who lived around them were at a much lower cultural, educational, a more primitive culture than existed in the Sephardic land. In the Ashkenazic lands, the Jews lived organically, plus Christianity had a more negative interaction with Judaism than Islam did in the Golden Age in Spain. And in general, we'll talk about it. But in Ashkenaz, there was much more of Jews living alone, developing within. When a yeshiva boy would say in studying, the Welt fragt, the world asks a question, there was no question what the world meant. It meant the world of Torah, the world of Jews. There was no other world. We lived a world of splendid isolation, a world where our own culture was organic. We had to keep the walls up. We had to somehow deal with the Gentiles when it came to persecution or business. And we had people that would intervene for us. But there was no symbiosis. There was no interaction on a cultural level. There was nothing to take from. As opposed to in the Sephardic world, starting from Iraq and going to Spain, as we're going to see, the doors were all open for Jews. They were all doctors and philosophers, and they were fully engaged in the culture of the time, becoming leaders in these countries, even if they had second status called dhimmi. Even if they have those second-class citizenship, they still become very much part of the society for different reasons. And how they react to the external world are very different. Ashkenaz, there's nothing to embrace. Sephard is embracing, but there are challenges. Here are the big challenges. Yes.
When I went to Italy, I met people in the Italian community near the Vatican.
Yes.
They told me that, I just went to dinner. They told me that they didn't consider themselves Sephardic or Ashkenazi. They were like the original Jews that came.
Correct.
And then they stayed there.
Correct, but their descendants went down. You're right. Italian Jewry, as you'll see, and we'll see some of the maps I showed last week, but I have it again. Italian Jews were their own entity, but their descendants go down to Germany and to France, and that becomes Ashkenaz. So Italy is true, does have its own.
But those people still live there.
Yeah. So their prayers are the same. Yeah, their own rite of prayer is a little bit different. Customs. Yeah, different, but a lot of it Right, so some things are cultural, but yes, they do have their own distinct identity. And the way to tell much of it today, there's a lot of cross-homogenization in all the Jewish communities. So food and prayer ritual, prayer rite, versions of the prayer book, certain poetry they read, that's where you'll see it more noticeable. But in actual Jewish law, pretty much there's a lot of cross-pollination. Like if you watch the video from last week, you'll see how that happened. But this is the big question. The challenge of philosophy is a question of, is it one of rejection? Is it adaptation, integration, or assimilation? And what I mean to say is, here are the challenges. I'm just going to read it though, if you can't see it all. Sorry if it's too much. These are just some of the ideas that I thought of as going through the different historical events that led to this. Are we too warm? It's okay in here. You turn down a drop, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so there were religious arguments in favor of engaging Greek philosophy. We'll talk about how that happened. Yes.
I was just gonna say, I'm sure you're gonna get there, but Greek philosophy was actually lost in Europe, other than Spain, for 1,000 years.
Right, we gave it to them.
Dark ages.
Right, the Jews were the carriers of it.
Right, through the Spanish.
And through the Arabs.
Yeah.
And through the Muslims.
Which they dragged with them.
Right, so we're going to talk about the scholastics in the Christian world and where philosophy comes back.
To track philosophy where philosophy didn't exist.
Correct.
It's the Greek philosophy.
Correct. No, for sure. But I was talking for the Ashkenazi Jews, not just philosophy, culture, integration, which that was really the next, after we're done philosophy, just talking about the overview, I just want to open it up to a conversation about our day and age, about the challenges of how do we respond to the dominant culture and philosophies and secular wisdom, and how the traditional Jewish world has effect on our world today. When you look at communities such as the modern Orthodox or the ultra-Orthodox, I'm using those phrases, but more insular communities versus more open communities, they are a direct result of many of these battles that go back 1,000 years and discussions. So, in favor of Greek philosophy, we did not yet get how it got there, but I just want to start the conversation. Number one, true beliefs based on human logic and understanding is the highest form of connecting to the divine. This is a religious belief among some, that the highest thing is to understand God, understand what you don't understand how God interacts with the world. Number two, it's a mitzvah. It says in the Torah, know the Lord your God. So the way to know it is through using reason and logic. And they understood that philosophy of their time was the height of reason and logic. It's not like a separate thing. It's reason and logic. And human beings have a brain, and there's a reason for it. And that brain is not just to understand Jewish law, it's to strive to understand the divine. Number three, using philosophy also aligned reason with revelation and makes for a more holistic, complete life, non-fragmented. If you're doing things because you're supposed to, but you're living a life with a dichotomy, with a split, you're not going to have a holistic life. There are people today that in one half of their life, they're totally engaged in the secular world, and the other half, there's a religious identity, but these parts never meet. It's a bifurcated life. It's not a holistic life. So if I can make my reason and the science of the day fit with my religion, which, by the way, philosophy and science were one thing in those days. Aristotle and these people were seen as scientists. And even by the later Arabs, they took these ideas and developed them, but it was the science of the day was philosophy, natural philosophy. But even things, whether atom and the vacuum and all these issues that they debated would be you call it the natural sciences today, what they call natural philosophy.
Even Newton was a natural philosopher. He was a philosopher as much as a scientist.
Right.
They didn't separate it.
They didn't separate it. And therefore, for the Jew as well, you're not taking one without the other. So, but even more than that. So here's the issue. That's one approach. These first three are seen as a value. But then there's a necessity. What do you do if you live in a culture where people are becoming acculturated and they're exposed to these ideas and they're brilliant ideas and they're causing people to have doubts about their religion? They're perplexed. They're like, how do I reconcile Judaism with all this isms that the world is promoting and that this seems so logical and reasonable? So there are people, even if it's not a value, it's a reality that you've got to respond to these people or you're going to lose a whole segment of your population. So it's a necessity. Then the next level, even the way I numbered it was, even if you don't see it as a religious value, it could be a necessity. How about if you're being attacked by all these groups that are trying to divide Judaism? The Karaites, we'll talk about who they are, and the Christians and the Muslims. You have to have tools to debate them if they're using philosophy. You can't come to a gunfight with nothing. You're gonna come and you're gonna say the Torah says. They're gonna beat you to a pulp intellectually. They're gonna turn you. You have to be fully vested in it. Another idea, it allows Jews and Judaism to be respected by the nations. That's a value too. They should respect God and they should respect the Jewish people. We shouldn't be downtrodden. We should have a sense of dignity, which if they respect us as scientists and as philosophers, we'll have that. You gotta talk well. If you live in the Arab world, you gotta write well. You be able to write songs, poetry. You have to carry yourself well. You can't be a peasant living in a cave somewhere. You gotta join civilization. These are some dangers here. I'm laying the groundwork for the other side too. All right, in addition, they would say, now there's other, these are not across the board. Each of these things are not said by any one group, all of them together. There are different groups. One group says, first of all, it's not Greek, it's logic and reason. It happens to be the Greeks are the ones that refined it, but their human brain doesn't belong to the Greeks. Reason, logic, all the rules of logic, they don't belong to the Greeks, it's reason. Another one is the Jews also had a philosophy. We had one. We had this philosophy, but because of persecution, we lost it. So now we have to make do by using the language and the tools that are in our world, because we're not going to recreate from new. And the third approach, which again, this third one may seem like fantasy, but there are even traditions among Greeks from over 300 BC that claim that Aristotle got his wisdom from Solomon, from the Jews. There are legends like that. I'm not saying this is historically true, because I don't know enough and nobody knows, but there are legends like that. The point is, was there encounters earlier time? There are stories of Abraham sending away his children, it says in the Torah, from his last wife to the east and gives them gifts. And the mystical works say he gave them special names of meditation or impurity.
The Philistines came from.
Say it again.
The Philistines came from Greece.
Weren't they a fearing nation? There were two of them. There were two groups. They come from up there,
Islands, Greece.
right? So the island there. So fascinating. But I would just to go back for a second. So all these legends that I went off on a tangent with Abraham and his family, but there are these legends that Aristotle shows up with Alexander the Great in the Second Temple. He was his teacher, and he shows up and he finds King Solomon's wisdom. Now, this could be after the fact, Jews trying to defend their heritage, that we're not just taking from the Greeks, but we also are, we're the original source of it. Whether it's true or not, again, this is the narrative that people would say, we're just reclaiming that which is ours. And I just want to say there's an element there where we're after the fact trying to make it more acceptable to Judaism. Yes.
Yeah, how is it that, I'm looking at number 2,
Yes.
in addition. How did we lose philosophy because of this?
Because this is when Maimonides writes about, this is his thing he puts in. He says, if you look in the Midrash, there are allusions to deep mystical, deep philosophical truths and ideas about God, hidden wisdom. But it was only passed on mouth to mouth, because it says in the Talmud, the secrets of the universe are not for public consumption. They are an esoteric wisdom, which Maimonides relates to not Kabbalah in his writing. He relates it to deep philosophical ideas. And it wasn't for the masses, and it was for an elite, and it was mouth to mouth, student to student. And they didn't write it down, the other stuff, the Mishnah and the Talmud, they wrote down to save it. This other stuff stayed oral, and it was not taught into big groups of many people memorized. It was a very limited group. You'll see the Kabbalists are going to use the same argument about having a secret wisdom that's transmitted from the prophets as well. But Maimonides is talking about philosophical wisdom, metaphysics, whatever term you want to use that they were using in those days. He understood that these things, because of persecution, many of the ideas were lost.
Carriers, so
The carriers are lost, and therefore the wisdom is lost. And we have little, you can open up the Midrash and you see, he's going to weave a whole book using rabbinic quotes together with Greek thought, and he's going to reconstruct what he believes is truth of Judaism, even though it's using Greek garb and Greek language. So, in other words, we're going to see that tweaking of Maimonides, but this is the argument in favor. Yes.
very quickly to this topic. I think the golden rule itself is still being discussed, whether it was Judaism first or Greeks first, because
Well-
they both see it as one of the foundational sort of statements there.
Correct.
So it could
Aristotle
be
is famous for
same
that.
vein of having that
Right.
as pretty early in the
Right, so we have it early on too, but Maimonides develops it using much of the language of Aristotle. The golden mean is that
golden rule.
golden.
Unto you.
Oh, that's not for the
Yeah.
Greeks. That debate is about Christianity and
But
Judaism.
They would call it Greek philosophy had that.
Uh-huh.
In.
Oh, okay, but that's in the
Just-
Torah. But that's in the Torah. That predates
Sure,
them.
sure, sure.
No, but that predates them. No, but the golden mean, which is taken from Aristotle's language, which is the idea of that if you are very high strung, if you're a big giver financially, or you're very miserly, the ultimate is the middle of the road. That's the golden mean. And there he uses Aristotle's language, but what we're going to discover, he tweaks different ideas, Maimonides, to make it more Jewish. And this is the big debate. How Jewish is the philosophy and how Greek is it? And therefore it is pushback.
Isn't the guide for blacks, isn't that a lot rooted in Greek philosophy?
Absolutely, in Aristotle, we're going to get to that. It's exactly the point where the battles we're going to take place. All of Jewish philosophy can be said as being footnotes to Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. Or if you don't want to say that, it is all engaged with it, either rejecting it, embracing it, reinterpreting it, changing its approach, adopting some. It becomes a canon of its own in a way. Maimonides, in a way, becomes a canon where everyone is dealing with it. Right? It doesn't become binding in all Jews, but it becomes the place where much of the debate takes place in philosophy. All right, so here is reasons against Greek philosophy. Philosophy doesn't lead to truth necessarily. You put 50 philosophers in a room, you have 50 opinions. So why are you telling me that reason and logic by having everyone in a room is going to make us agree? It'll be a disaster. The next one is revelation and transmission through history is a source of our faith. Number 3 problem, Greek wisdom includes heretical wisdom and leads one astray in belief. Number 4, it will lead people to question the faith. It's dangerous. It might be helpful in medicine to one, but it may be bad for others. Now, here's the issue. If you say, number 5, if you say that true beliefs, which philosophers are into, is more important than action, then people are going to drop religious obligations. Just by virtue of what's more important, how you think or what you do. Once you change the hierarchy of structure, you're in trouble. Big problem. Next one is, the philosophy becomes more important than Torah. Maimonides writes a letter to the sages of Lunel, who are in this interesting area, which is called Provence, which is this middle ground between Sfarad and Ashkenaz. They become the carriers of Arabic culture into Europe, both for Jews and for Gentiles. We're going to talk about them, in particular the Ibn Tibbon family. But he writes to them how, he writes to the sages a letter, they were talking letters back and forth about his work, and he says, from the beginning of my youth, I treated science and philosophy as the handmaids to my true love, God's Torah. But what should I do? And now the cooks and the servants are taking over, so to speak, my life. I end up spending more time with them than I am with my one true love. What was supposed to be a servant has now become the queen. This is the question about when you bring in the secular world into your life, what becomes predominant when it comes to study, when it comes to time, and when it comes to value.
Philosophically speaking, it's materialism creating ideas for ideas, creating material actions, so to speak, right? So in philosophy, you will see what's primary. the ideas creating the world, but the world generating ideas. And so you need to first act and then the ideas will emerge.
Right, but also the idea of making philosophy into a religious value in and of itself as being the apex, so you divorce it from action to some degree is the concern. Because if you have a hierarchy of values, what's more important? Torah study, doing mitzvahs, or contemplation on philosophical ideas. Once you make contemplation of philosophical ideas the most important thing, so you're going to end up weakening some other elements as well. Okay, another one is, if you make symbolism more important, then you could allegorize everything in the Torah. Everything becomes an allegory, even your tefillin. You should bind the sign upon your hand. Oh, that means think about it all the time. Early Christians did this with our religion too. They took the mitzvahs, they made them all into symbolism. But philosophically, when you start talking about how every mitzvah leads to, first of all, it leads to true beliefs, so you weaken the value of the mitzvah, because it's all about leading to true belief. Let's say kosher is designed to make you more sensitive to killing an animal, the laws of slaughter. So then being sensitive to animals is more important than slaughter. But then we say, philosophy is always looking for symbols. So if you look at the story of Adam and Eve and Sarah and Abraham, you say Sarah and Abraham are the body and the soul, and they represent this type of struggle that we have with our own soul. If you allegorize everything, so then it stops being binding and real, even into behavior. That was a challenge. We're going to get to this more. These are all little tidbits. We're going to see it as we go through the story. It gets more engaged in a moment. And here's the other one, the big one. It can and did lead to a lack of commitment. A rabbi who fled in 1492, the end of the period of Jewish philosophy, it closes with the Sephardic doors closing behind the Jews. 1492, ocean blue, the Jews are expelled from Spain. 1 million of them choose to stay and convert to Christianity instead of fleeing with their compatriots. Instead of doing what Ashkenazic Jews did, which was they were always willing to be expelled, always willing to be killed for their faith. So one of the rabbis, and more than one, and even some historians today will say, the reason why the Sephardic Jews did not have the gumption to stand up for their faith was because they already got used to philosophizing everything. And they were able to see that beliefs are more important than action. I'll bend my head, I'll fit in with everybody else, and the storm will pass. Isabel and Ferdinand, these people will move on and something else will happen. It goes on for a couple hundred years, it doesn't happen. And these people are lost.
Kept something secret, right?
How long does that last? It can last for 50 years, 60 years. Take a look even in Soviet Russia. Could it have lasted 200 years if it was under Stalin? No way. And if you think about what was going on there, and you get killed and burnt at the stake over there in Spain. It didn't last. It didn't last. You know, Christopher Columbus, it seems like his grandparents might have been Jewish, but he had become a Hebrew Christian for all intents and purposes. In other words, they merged certain elements. They kept symbolism. When they come out to Amsterdam, the ones that do escape, they're totally lost. It's not an accident that all the heretical movements and all these issues happen in this period when these Jews come out of Spain, totally ignorant of their heritage, and they had been philosophically trained.
Very short story, if I may.
Yes,
So,
please. Please.
Yeah. So a friend of mine, actually, who's Jewish, spent a lot of time in New Mexico, and was very surprised by people there who were from Mexico, actually, and came or maybe even lived there all their lives when it was still Mexico. Still, for reasons they didn't know, would light a candle on Saturdays and did a lot of other things, and they had this tradition that they might actually at some point.
Yeah, and there was Inquisition in Mexico. They burned people at the stake there. Yeah.
It's like almost a lost tribe.
Right, so it's hard to know. In other words, if the mother wasn't Jewish. There's a book called the Mezuzah and the Madonna's Foot.
I read that.
You know, just the title is worth it. I don't know about the book itself. I wasn't so interested in.
Code that those people in New Mexico, they
But
were
this is a
getting
cultural
the gene,
Yeah.
breast cancer, and they did a genealogy and they realized they were Jewish.
Or the Jewish.
Yeah.
People at the table people on Friday night.
Jewish ancestry, because the mom is not
Yeah,
Jewish
so
at any
it's
one
like
point, you're no longer
echoes-
Jewish.
Echoes of that time, but not really preserving that.
Right, no, of course, it's echoes. Listen, the way the English, what they said about the Spanish, they said everyone when they were fighting the Spanish navies fighting with English navies, the taunt to Spain was, "You're all Jewish." Well, you're 1 million Jews at the highest levels convert. Who do you think your mother and your father ended up being? You guys, you anti-Semites, which is why the first racial battles happened in Spain when you had these peasants who tried to usurp.
Torquemada was-
Really Jewish too, but the lower people, when Spain collapses in and of itself, it's because of these battles where they're trying to get rid of all the leadership, they're killing all the top leaders because of their mixed blood. Now the blood has become an issue. It was first faith, but you can't trust a Jew anymore because you had all those Marranos. But even post that, there was that idea that we're some sort of cabal. So there was this leads to all these type of issues, but coming full circle,
But if we were, we could eat rice that cake.
if you're Sephardic, if you're Sephardic, but we can get to Sephardic, that doesn't make you Sephardic. Okay, so the other element is, if you see all religions being similar and have universal truths, and you see is no longer anything unique to Judaism, in the arena you value most, because the philosophy was shared by everyone, and also you have more in common with allegiance to the philosophers and your people. Okay, so in our day, this is the question about rejection, adaptation, integration, assimilation, challenges of modernity, challenges of secular culture, challenges of secular wisdom. Do I live in a secular world and visit a Jewish world once a week for a Friday night dinner? Where am I living, so to speak? What is my mindset? What are my values? What am I willing to live for? What am I willing to die for? All this has impact. I would just say, if you look at the modern Orthodox world, they will have much more engagement with the secular world as far as a value system than you would have in the ultra-Orthodox world. We'll see how these things develop. But I just want to throw it out there because this conversation still continues today in the traditional world as well, is that on one hand, the Sephardic world had an incredibly rich, beautiful life. On the other hand, there were certain challenges associated with it. And Ashkenaz had a beautiful, rich life, and there were challenges associated with that. Okay, here we go. We're going to jump in. This is just a non-Jewish picture of the philosophers of the time. So you have the Greek period is this yellow on the left. So you don't have to see the names, Aristotle and Plato. Then you have the Roman Empire, that's the red ones. And the next period, that's from like 200 to 600. The Jews are not engaged in philosophy, but what is happening, what is fascinating, in the end of the second temple period, there's a guy called Philon or Philo. In England, in America, they call him Philo. But Philo is a Jew living in Alexandria who does the first unification of biblical scripture with philosophy. He takes Greek thought, he marries Jerusalem to Athens. And the Jews don't care outside of Greece, outside of Alexandria, where the Hellenist culture of Egypt. The Jews outside don't care. He wrote in Greek, he wrote to his compatriots. The people of Talmud are not engaged in this, but he is. He's living in Hellenist country. Now, all those Jews assimilate or are lost, and we don't have those works. You know who kept those works? The church fathers. It made, he talks about how first was the word, logos. These things end up in Christian scripture. He becomes the teacher of how do you meld Athens with the Bible, Greek philosophy with the Bible. So the Christians adopt it. Later on, when the Muslims conquer the Christians, so in the year 600, they are engaged with a sophisticated culture, and they have their Quran, and they adopt this kalam, it's called, which is biblical philosophy, started by this Jew, taken over by Christians, because the Jews were not into it, but he made a whole work of explaining the whole Bible. They took all those ideas and started applying them to their Bible. So this is the secret history of the Jewish connection to the Kalam, which is the Islamic philosophy that is trying to make religion compatible with what they call reason. What us call it better though, religion and philosophy, or Bible and Holy Scripture with philosophy. So the Jews, Philo did it first for the Torah. Along comes the Christians, they take it and they apply it to the Torah and the New Testament. Along comes the Muslims and apply it to the Quran. And this is the situation. If you look here, the blue ones are Jews. And some of these Jews are philosophers of equal weight than the greatest Islamic philosophers. Maimonides ends up influencing many of these others, Aquinas in the Christian world. So they're for sure Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the Spanish period, the Golden Age, are engaged with each other in philosophy. It is a cross-cultural engagement. Okay, the first book, though, is in 933 in Iraq, from Saadia Gaon, the first book of Jewish philosophy. Saadia Gaon was a polymath. He was incredible. He comes from Egypt. He takes over the yeshivas of Babylon. To take over yeshiva that's been around for 800 years and you're an outsider, you got to be something exceptional. He waged war against the Karaites. The Karaites were a group of Jews that broke off from traditional Judaism. He ascribed to a literal reading of the text. He also wrote a prayer book. He wrote poetry. He did Talmudic response. He translated the Bible, and he wrote a book of philosophy. And he writes, I want to align philosophy with the Torah. And he says there are different ways you could know things. You could senses, you could touch, you could have logic. He says you could infer something, and then you can have tradition. And he said, I want to bring them in alignment with one another. They're not in contradiction with one another. So he says here, what did he say here? There's a line here. Okay, so he says here, perception of the senses, the light of reason, and logical necessity, as well as a fourth, which is revelation. Okay, what happens? So this is his tree, so to speak, that you could use, but the point in short is he's making the Torah compatible, because what was happening was the Karaites were happening. Who are the Karaites? The Karaites was a rabbi by the name of Anan. He expected to become the head of the Jewish community of the yeshiva. He was a great scholar. His brother was the one that was appointed. He felt betrayed by everybody. Either he's thrown to prison first because of he's rebelling or whatever the understanding is. At a certain point, he says to the Sultan or the whatever the ruler was of the time in Baghdad, he says, I'm not the same religion as these Jews. I understand the Torah differently. And he says, everyone has the obligation to interpret the Torah using their own mind. This is called Karaite. There is no rabbinic tradition. It's only the Torah. You got to analyze every word of the Torah, but you got to use your own. The problem is you have an army of one. How do you create a community? At a certain point, they're going to have to make their own traditions. Otherwise, everyone's arguing with everybody. If you thought a regular Orthodox shul was bad, imagine if everyone has the right to interpret Torah with no tradition. That's what happens. You get 1,000 denominations in a minute. So this is the Karaites. They start using philosophy because they see the weak underbelly of Judaism is the fact that rabbinic Judaism, just like the Torah itself, uses anthropomorphic imagery. And because you're living among Islam, where anthropomorphism, the idea that God has a body, is something which is so outrageous to them, so they see this as something to attack the Jews with, because the Talmud will sometimes say, just like the Torah, God was sitting on his throne. Now, you remember from our first class in the Targumim, the translations, that Unclus and these others, which were from the year, 100 BC, I mean, some of them were written a little bit later, 50 of the Common Era, but these were all already, and even before that, they were being careful not to use euphemisms when God's hand, God's glory, God's throne, they wouldn't ascribe physical attributes to God. It already existed in Judaism. But here, he had to explain the whole Torah that way, but he also felt the philosophy was important to show how the beliefs of traditional rabbinic Judaism was compatible with philosophy. So you could call it apologetics, because what a kalam does, it says, okay, how can I make sense of this biblical text using the philosophy? It's not, Maimonides critiques it, as we'll see in a minute, but it was the first work of philosophy, and he sees that religion and revelation are not a contradiction, and you just have to line it up right. Maimonides had an issue with you're trying too hard sometimes. Sometimes you're trying to just link things up without doing deep thought about it. You're following the footsteps of these Muslim philosophers who are apologetics, who are following the footsteps of the Christian philosophers who are apologetics, even though they probably didn't know about Philo. We know about Philo today, and we see the roots of his work. Okay, but here, the Golden Age of Spain is really where all the action takes place. So here's the timeline. First, you have the early Christian period, the Visigoths, pre-711. The Muslim period is from 711 to the 12th century. That is the Golden Age of Spain. Then, when the Christians conquer Spain from 12th century to 1492, the Jews still have much more engagement and involvement in the secular culture than Jews in Germany and Poland, because of unique historical circumstances, despite the fact they end up getting expelled in the end. But till then, the Abarbanel and all these others are great leaders of the Christian Spain as well, not just Islamic Spain. What happened? Here's the early Christian period. I'm just going to paraphrase a little bit. Is that initially the Visigoths were tolerant, but then they become Christians and they become pagans who became true believers were the most dangerous. The Lithuanians were pagans until probably the 1700s. Dangerous people. In other words, if you're a pagan, then you become religious. There's no modifying influence of civilization. You go from eating the hearts of your enemies to Western religion. It doesn't happen right away. Okay, how do the Jews respond in this early period of the 700s? Some flee to France and North Africa. So that's like the first Sephardic. Early, they go back. Some converted, some practiced Judaism in secret. They were Marranos. Many of them were forced to convert also. So, under threat of death. Okay, what happens is the Muslims invade Spain, they take over. The Jews are happy. You know why? They're not killing them. So the Muslims are good. And not just what happens is the Jews and Christians are both given protected status, and they can worship as long as they submit to Muslim rule. Okay, dhimmi status. Okay, and here's the issue. The Muslim armies are overextended. Their supply chain, all these issues are a problem. They don't know the terrain. The Jews have been living there for a couple hundred years. They know the place. They know their thing. They're educated, literate, they're skilled, and they don't pose a threat. Better yet, they bring them in. So the Cordova, Spain becomes a center of cultural life. Huge libraries. He brings in the Jews, scholars, philosophers, poets to Cordova. So this becomes, so if you look, Andalusia is the center of this area that becomes this prime cultural center for cultural life at that time and of a golden age. You have Chazal ibn Shaprut, he's the caliph's physician. He translates classic works of science into Arabic. We're going to talk about the next generation that does it the other way. He becomes the head of the Jewish community. He corresponds to Jewish communities in Italy and France. And there's a kingdom that converts to Judaism in between the Khazars, in between the Muslims and the Christians of Russia are sandwiched a little pagan nation, the Khazaria. So Khazaria, no, not Khazar, no, not Khazarai. The Khazars are a nation that converts to Judaism. Could be it's just the leadership. We're not sure how many of the people did. Yeah, exactly. Crimea is the area.
No, she was saying that in the Crimea, but it was like more Karaites, Koreans.
Oh, yeah, not Karaites, right? This is Khazars.
Khazars
are a different
very
entity.
famous, because the early Kiev princes, they were warring with them all the time.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
They were they were the big fur hats. They were coming back to down and forth. They were the trade route. But basically, in between the Byzantine Empire and Russia, so between the Muslims and the Christians, they choose to be autonomous. They didn't choose to be independent. I'm sorry, by converting to Judaism. That was now the story behind it is he says he has the letter, he had a dream, and why he chooses Judaism. It's going to become important because this historical story becomes a motif in the philosopher that we're going to encounter shortly. So just remember the Khazars, don't forget them. They're a fascinating conversation in general, because as Jews, an independent warlike kingdom is always wonderful. The truth is there were a bunch of in Saudi Arabia before the Muslims. You had these independent tribes of Jews. The Jews were there before they take over.
The Jews were in Medina when Muhammad went.
And they were tribes, and some of them were warlike tribes. And you had kingdoms too. So this existed. All right, so what happens now? Muslim Spain is the cutting edge of culture, math, philosophy, poetry. The Arabs translate Greek works of philosophy, and Jews are reading them and writing Jewish philosophy, which we're going to talk about, and poetry. There's competitive imitation taking place. You're showing how beautiful Arabic is. We're going to show how beautiful Hebrew is. They're making poetry and songs, and it's developing the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language had not been a spoken language for hundreds of years. It was studied, but it wasn't spoken. They spoke Aramaic. So here they are developing the culture, developing poetry, developing all these ideas. So Yehuda Halevi is the first anti-philosopher. What I mean to say is he uses philosophical language to say what I said before. He say you can't use philosophy to determine truth. We have revelation. He had lived in this lap of luxury, in this unique system of Spain, where the Jews were able to reach the highest levels, although there were pogroms at times. There was one rabbi who wrote an intro to the Talmud and the rules of interpretation, and he became the general of the Caliph's army, the commander-in-chief. His name was Shmuel Hanagid, Shmuel the Prince. His son gets massacred by the Muslims at a certain riot later on after his passing. But he's an amazing person. They write poetry, and they write love poetry and drinking poetry, and they write books on the Talmud, they write books of philosophy. I mean, it's a very colorful time. But he says, I see how the leadership, this culture has sapped the Jewish fervor and Jewish commitment. You're becoming like everybody else. He says, I'm moving to Israel. And he takes a trip. He's the one, Sion, 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 Halo Tishali, the songs of the earliest Zionist movement. They took a lot of it from him. He said, if I would just have wings like a dove, I would fly. He ends up, whether he makes it to Israel or not, it's not so clear. There's a legend that he arrives in Israel and an Arab swordsman kills him as he's bowing down. We don't know what happens afterwards. But he wrote an incredible work of anti-philosophy. What he said was, revelation is key. God reveals himself. The Jewish people have a unique role in history, and them living in the Holy Land is the natural habitat that allows prophecy to grow. And he makes a book where there's a debate for this Khazar kingdom that had happened 200 years earlier. He makes a fictitious debate, okay? So a rabbi walks into a bar in this book, but it's not just a rabbi. There's a philosopher, there's a Karaite, Christian, a Muslim, and a rabbi. And they're debating in front of this king. And the king originally doesn't want to deal with the rabbi. He says, why should I deal with the Jews?
The king is trying to choose
the right religion. Exactly. So he's hearing all sides of the story. So this rabbi gets to set everybody up from Yehuda Halevi to show the uniqueness of Judaism. And he goes and he shows how the philosophy is not the way to truth. The Karaite is not the right thing. And Christianity and Islam both accept the roots of Judaism. And he shows this beauty. So it becomes a work of philosophy, but it's all about not philosophy. So that's Yehuda Halevi. So he presents the truth of Judaism. He says, he explains how there's this unique divine essence. So if you're going to talk about the two strands that develop in Jewish thought, we would say of philosophy, we would say you're going to have Maimonides being this arch rationalist, if you will, which is not so simple. He's really not. And then you have, on the other hand, you're going to have Yehuda Halevi. We can talk about the uniqueness of the Jewish soul, as opposed to philosophical ideas that can merge with other cultures. So you have these two approaches. Here comes Moses Maimonides, who's a Colossus, who basically, he didn't just write this book of Jewish law, he also does this philosophy. And of course, he takes care of the communities, he writes letters to everyone, but he becomes the work. Why is this so? A short history. Maimonides is what happens is the Almohads, or a fanatical sect from northern Africa, invade Spain. And we're going to see the history exactly. Invade Spain, and the Rambam is forced to flee first in other parts of Spain, which were not under them, and then he goes to Morocco, and then he ends up in Israel, and then he ends up in Egypt.
They were fundamentalists.
Total fundamentalists, right? They were violent fundamentalists. So the Rambam ends up going from Spain to Fez to Jerusalem and to Cairo. Ultimately in Cairo, that's the Rambam. He writes many of his works. He writes traveling. He writes on a boat from memory. His commentary on the Mishnah. Okay, but we're talking about today the guide for the perplexed. He writes, I have a student, and this student wants to have the truth of, he's perplexed by the conflicts of philosophy and religion. So I'm going to write you a book. He's writing a book for this one student. He's writing him letters, and he's keeping carbon copies for himself, not carbon, but they're writing copies. He's keeping it. And this book becomes a guide for perplexed. If you ask a academic or a secular knowledgeable Jew, what is Maimonides famous for? They'll say the guide for the perplexed. You ask a yeshiva student, he'll say the book of law, Yada Chazaka, Mishnah Torah, because it seems to be two different worlds and two different elements. And again, people struggle to reconcile these two Maimonides, if you will. There's a famous line that everyone has my Maimonides. Everyone interprets Maimonides in their way. But we're going to talk when we get to Kabbalah a little bit about some of these elements. Because Maimonides ends up influencing how Kabbalistic thought develops as well, even though he's using Greek philosophical terms. Okay, so he writes a guide for perplexed, the people who are well-versed in the written oral Torah but attracted to science and philosophy. So he originally writes, it's for those who are perplexed. I'm going to help them. But really, it does seem that he does value philosophy as being a key of understanding the truths of the divine. Because sometimes, though, he does. Imagine today if I have people who are on the edge of religion, and I feel let me pull them, let me keep them from cutting and severing their connection by, let's say, we're talking about the age of the universe. All right, I won't take a literalist view. It doesn't affect Jewish law. I'll go along with that. Someone could say. Others would say, well, there's no need to quickly jump to conclusions and start changing your faith because of what modern scientists are saying. Do you have this type of debate that's going on? Ramani seems to be saying, I'm going to give explanations that are acceptable to reason, but are not always his deep truth. And here's another big problem with Maimonides. He believes that there's esoteric and exoteric beliefs, that he doesn't believe that everything should be said. He says that himself. I'm going to write things in a riddle here. So you don't know what's really going on beneath the surface always. Is he giving you a surface and there's something deeper? And because he allows for that, that allows for many people to interpret into Maimonides different approaches. So just a thing to know about Maimonides. On the other hand, it's a very useful book. It explains prophecy and biblical stories and language of the Torah in a consistent, organized way. You get a vocabulary. What does it mean, the hand of God? What does it mean, the foot of God? What does it mean, a miracle? How do angels work? The whole systems that you could then apply to other things. Okay, so what happens, though, is that these philosophical works are the Jews are translating from Arabic into Latin, and we're going to talk about how that happens. So Maimonides, I paraphrase this right, but Maimonides tells us that we had lost some of these philosophical ideas. In other words, we had our own philosophy, but because of it being passed mouth to mouth and individuals, we didn't keep it. So now we're among these others. Because some rabbis wholeheartedly accepted Islamic philosophy. He says, that's not rigorous enough for me. You have to use logic and reason in a very rigorous way. And he believes Aristotle is the apex of reason for that time. And there are certain he wasn't reading in Greek. There were certain Islamic thinkers, great philosophers that had taken these ideas and translated from Aristotle into Arabic. So we're going to see a letter, for example, but first a quick history. So in 720, this is what it looks like. You have the Caliphate. This is a good time, 921. And then these are different rabbis, 948, 999. Then the Civil War. The Civil War, let me move my thing here so you can see it. The Civil War is going to, the red is the Christian states, the green is Islamic states, but then everything gets divided up into these different groups, and the Almohads are going to show up. They're a Berber dynasty from Morocco. They show up and they take over. Okay, so what happens is the Almohads, but that doesn't, what the Jews end up doing in that period is they flee to, many of them, towards France. So you end up with this group of community called Provence or Occitan. It becomes this Montpellier, Toulouse. These towns, these cities become a center of Jewish life. And they are the nexus in between the Ashkenazic world and the Sephardic world. And they are the carriers in both ways of the tradition. They become Talmudists, influenced by the Ashkenazic rabbis. They become philosophers influenced by the Sephardic rabbis. And there's a mix, but there's also conflict there because they're the first line of defense in each direction. Okay, so there's lots of migration. So it's cross-pollination. Jews get expelled in this period and throughout those couple hundred years. Okay, so the end of the golden era in Spain is 1200. Okay, because after the Almohads, the reconquest, the Jews that are there or come back and all that have a lesser degree of independence, but still pretty good. But the golden age is really in that period that ends with the 1200s. Okay. Okay, so what happens is you have this family called Ibn Tibbon family. The Ibn Tibbon family are the transmitters of these Jewish philosophical works, and they're translating Maimonides in his lifetime. The reason why certain Arabic works did not last is because if they weren't translated by the time most Jews were no longer speaking Arabic, they could be lost. In other words, certain very popular books stayed among the peasant Jews that maybe stayed in different places that spoke Arabic. But in general, the philosophy and all that was being translated by this family, Ibn Tibbon. So they are, if you take a look, here's the map. You're talking about Italy before. See, Italy is its own identity. So if you're doing Sfard is going to be Spain and North Africa. You're going to have Ashkenaz will be northern Europe. And then you have Italy, it's an identity of its own. Byzantium has its own identity. And then you have the Persian and the Orient has also an identity of its own. Today, we look at Sephardic and Ashkenaz as this type of big groups, but really they were more subtle. And they still are more subtle if you look closely with a magnifying glass. So these people in Provence are sitting at the crossroads of Jewish history. So the Ibn Tibbon family are translating everything, though. They're translating astronomy, astrology, medicine, Plato, Aristotle, and these great Islamic philosophers. Why? So it seems that this movement that spreads from them becomes a school of thought called Maimonideism, where they're interpreting the Rambam. You would call it that. So here's a letter that the Rambam writes to him. He had written a letter to the Rambam saying he wants to meet him because he's working on a translation. These people made a whole vocabulary in Hebrew from the Arabic philosophical language of the Greek philosophical language that was then used by generations to explain philosophical ideas. So he's writing a letter, and the Rambam tells them what are the fundamental. He believes Aristotle. So historians today will say, if you look at what books they were copying and translating, it's a direct response the next 200 years of these letters from Maimonides telling them what the hierarchy of importance is in philosophy, who are the books you should. I'm not going to get into all these people, but Averroes, Ibn Rashid, these are Arab thinkers. So basically he says, these are the ones you should write. Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi. So these people are commentators on Greek thought. And some of them are Muslims, but many of them are just explaining philosophy. Okay, so what happens is, so these teachers are the ones that the Maimonides suggest, and they translate all this. So all these people, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, these people, some of them living the same time as the Rambam, some a bit before, but he's familiar with all the works, they're having these conversations, they're influencing, like Olchenko said before, they ultimately influence, as Christianity wakes up from his deep slumber in Europe, Europe wakes up from his deep slumber and begins to get into Latin, translated these works from the Jews. The Jews are translating them for the non-Jews. That's how the initial reaction is getting into that world. So the Jews had feet in both worlds. So why was the guy so controversial? Because he brings Greek philosophy into Judaism. We covered some of the areas before. Why it was a challenge. So there was a big debate. There were 4 debates that we spoke about with Maimonides. One we spoke about last week with Jewish law. Why were they upset with Jewish law? Because he wrote a book of Jewish law without writing sources, without writing the reason. And so there was a debate there about that. But it becomes really bad in the 1200s, is that the rabbis of Provence feel that the philosophy has taken over. It's like a new branch of Judaism, and it's swallowing up everything. People spend their time that, they're not doing Talmud, they're not doing Jewish law, they're living a life of the secular world, and it's leading people to even minimize the value of Judaism. So there was, and they felt also that some of the things he wrote went against their understanding of the Torah.
There was also a problem that the rabbis, when people come to the rabbi to help them interpret what the law, what they should do, who Maimonides' code they just had to go through that book and they didn't have to go so much.
So this is not about the code, though. In other words, that's a separate issue. That's going back to the class of yesterday, where last week, where the argument was that with Rambam's code, the rabbis would be out of a job.
Right.
But honestly, there were critics who may have said that, but ultimately the real problem, and if you watch the video of that I said, the real problem was you can't determine Jewish law for any new case from Maimonides. He doesn't give you the sources, but it is very useful for leading a Jewish life. Everyone had to know Jewish law. In other words, the type of stuff that's in Maimonides' law, you shouldn't have to go to a rabbi for. I'm not saying no one said that, but if you look at the broad literature, that was not the complaint about Maimonides' book of law. It was much more, you want us to accept your word and your decision as if it's a voice from Sinai. You're not telling us where you took it from, who died and made you boss. That's the Maimonidean law. I'm not saying no one said what you said. There were some who said that idea that they're going to cut out. But the reason they were afraid of being cut out was not because of determining law from the text. But if that text becomes accepted and you extrapolate from that text, they felt that would lead off in different directions. But there wasn't really job security issues in those days because rabbis weren't being paid in those days. So honestly, if you take a look, okay, maybe that is a theory that people do say, but if you look at the literature, that's really a tiny little element that one or two people may have said. I mean, maybe more said it, but in the literature, in the books, you don't see that as being the core complaint. But this is something much deeper. This is about philosophy. The law thing was pretty much taken care of to a great degree. Maimonides is firmly ensconced as a serious voice of Jewish law. But they're arguing now about the Greek philosophy brought into Judaism. So the first section of his guide of law, of his book of law, does deal with philosophical ideas, and the guide for perplexed. The battles got so bad that the Dominicans ended up burning Maimonides' guide for perplexed as heretical. Because if everyone's talking to each other and everyone's seeing what everyone else is saying about religion, so since these people are calling heretical, some even blame Jews for calling the Dominicans attention to it. But what happens then is 10 years after Maimonides' books are burned, so in front of Notre Dame, they burn all the Talmuds in France. 1240, they burned all the Talmuds. This has been a decree that was going on for a while. But the rabbis who were involved in this rabid war with philosophy all of a sudden realized, and they felt this was a punishment from heaven. They should not have burnt Maimonides' guide for the perplexed, even if, not even murder. They should have been fighting it like this, and it caused the desecration of God's name. And they believed it caused Judaism close to be extinguished. If you lose the Talmud and books of law, these are manuscripts. These are not books. So Rabbeinu Yonah, one of the great rabbis of that time, he takes upon himself penance to go to Maimonides' grave in Israel to ask forgiveness. He doesn't make it all the way there. He stops off. Yeshivas hire him. He's always on that journey, but he writes a book about repentance that becomes a classic. He's motivated by what it led to, this sort of battle. But it wasn't over, because the issue of philosophy is a very deep-seated issue. First, you had what I was talking before about, okay, is it of great value or is it a little value? Okay, we can debate that. But then when it starts having bad repercussions and people using it negatively, it causes a different response. So another 100 years later, there was a big issue that they were making allegory. There were Jews in certain communities considering the whole Torah as allegories. So there was a big debate. So the way it worked, if you remember, communities are independent. There is no chief rabbi of the Jews. So there's a great rabbi, the Rajba, who's writing a letter to his student in this other community, trying to talk to him about what's going on, is that there's a whole movement in your community of people not putting on tefillin, not keeping Jewish element, because they've begun to publicly, that's not the problem, that's privately, but publicly they're making everything into allegory. Again, he's hearing reports, there's back and forth, and his student defends himself. He says, you're attacking philosophy. We've been having philosophy as part of our curriculum for the last 100 years. And the truth is, the Rajba was not attacking philosophy per se. He was attacking what was happening with it. In other words, Maimonides was already protected, so to speak. In other words, Maimonides was seen as, the real deal. And this is the paradox. Maimonides made a bigger controversy because he was such a great Torah scholar and so accepted in Jewish law that his guide then became a big problem. If he was like Ibn Gabriel or one of these other poets that wrote a book of philosophy, all right, an eccentric Jew. All of a sudden, Maimonides, the rabbi of all the Jews, makes the head of the yeshiva Aristotle. That's a big problem. But not just that, the students also see it as a mode of total acculturation with a dominant society. You're able to communicate with the non-Jewish world as equals, and not just that, your religion is suffering. So he makes a ban in Barcelona that until the age 25, no studying philosophy or even natural sciences. The Raja makes this ban. He says for 50 years, we're going to try this to calm down what's happening. And then he reaches out. He said, I know you guys have autonomy. I want you to do to that your community, to your community too. No response. It didn't happen. And even with him, it had a life of its own. And it didn't snowball. In other words, it always breaks. This is the big issue. When you start introducing a new idea into Judaism, if it's a healthy immune system, it's going to push back. And then the question becomes, okay, can you integrate into Torah? Maimonides tweaks Aristotle. Maimonides uses biblical verses and Talmudic verses to explain every idea. So, for example, Aristotle is big on the eternity of the universe. Maimonides doesn't accept that. And he shows how it's intrinsic to Judaism. And he says Aristotle doesn't bring a proof for it. And it doesn't have necessarily a great proof for it. And he says it's not something that's provable. He talks about what's provable, it's not provable. But the point is, he says, we're going to follow our faith, and it's intrinsic to our faith. But and it's not against logic or against reason. He said, look, if it was against logic or reason, if we were able to reinterpret the Bible and says God has a body and make it all a metaphor, I could do the same for a lot of other things in Judaism too. But there's no necessity to do that. He felt logically there wasn't. Here's another example. The relationship for Aristotle between the deity, that which is above all, and human beings, is a one-way love affair. Human beings want to connect to that which gives them life. But the prime mover is unmoved by anything. God, being the source for the philosophers, he's not engaged in the world. He's not involved. We're looking for our source, but for Maimonides, the love goes both ways. When you connect to God through thought, God is caring about you. God is engaged with you. And there are very poetic descriptions. My point is that it is wearing Greek garb, but there are many who say, if you look closely, he's tweaking the Greek garb, and slowly it becomes Jewish garb, or Jewish inside in Greek garb. Okay, so this was the great challenge that did happen, this pushback. And here you have with the expulsion, this was what I read to you about how the simple folk did not give in to the temptation of converting and staying in Spain, is what this rabbi is part of those who were expelled from Spain. Now, some historians agree with that, others disagree. It's a historical debate. But the fact that Jews believe that tells us something, is that we see at the end of, after 1492, you really don't have, the age of philosophy is done in Judaism. It wakes up again in the 19th century. Let's say Samson or Paul Hirsch in Germany, where Jews are forced to respond to, in that case, it was reform, and to nationalism. And they're in a very secular, engaged culture, and they want to create a philosophy that resonates. So he's using nationalism and different ideas to describe Judaism. And then later on, Rabbi Soloveitchik in Yeshiva University is using philosophical ideas of the non-Jewish world to present Judaism. And the question always is, okay, how much are you impacted? Now, Kabbalistic literature did not get the same sort of pushback. It wasn't because they had connections in high places. We're going to talk next week about how Kabbalah develops. But what's clear is the level of pushback that they got, it wasn't seen as something foreign like Greek thought clearly was, despite some of those origin stories that some Jews may have told. Nevertheless, it's still the Kabbalah is seen much more organic. Now, philosophical language comes and merges Kabbalistic ideas, and you create different forms of Kabbalah, different forms of mystical thinking that's a mix of both philosophy and Kabbalah. So where we are today, there may be some people who live a life of Aristotle's thought that's in the Guide for the Perplexed, but most Jews are going to be taking from that, but also through those that came after him that end up filtering and changing. Now, just by the way, Maimonides wasn't the last word. There were many philosophers of his time and after him, rather, that argued with elements of his issue. Divine providence, what do you call again? Free choice, all these elements, they discuss these big issues, and there was some changes. But ultimately, what happened, the Jewish theology that becomes the theology from the time of exposure from Spain and onward for sure, becomes the mystical. All right, we'll take a look at a few ideas of philosophical ideas here. I'm going to skip to our textbook. We have a few minutes. I'm going to just do the idea of anger. If you trust in God and you believe that everything comes from God, so your attitude is going to be very different when someone betrays you. So I'm going to go to the end. We're not going to have time to do everything. So we'll pick this one idea. Trust in God. Going back. So trust in God. If you believe everything in our life has a divinely ordained purpose, so what's going to happen is everything that happens for a reason. If I believe that, and not just that, I'm moving towards a higher purpose, higher goal, everything that happens, even the painful things. I don't know, I don't understand, may not be in this world, we're moving. But that trust impacts the rest of our life. A person who says I'm self-reliant, he says their success and failure due to their own efforts. Or the fatalist is carefree and sees fate is entirely out of their hands. In Judaism, we have a combination of both. Trust means that you have to make a vessel, you have to try your best to be able to, we study this on Sunday mornings, the gate of trust, but this idea of having both things together. Bitachon is not fatalism and it's not self-reliance. It is a recognition that I'm supposed to do my best, and then whatever happens is in God's hands. But I can't not do my best.
What's the translation?
Bitachon means trust. Trust as opposed to faith. Trust in God means I'm relying that where I am is where I'm meant to be, and God leads me in the right place. So what he says is his idea is everything, in other words, in life that we encounter has purpose and meaning and design. And we have to recognize, though, that there are things that are vessels for the divine flow, but they're not the source of it. I have to recognize that if someone helps me out, I say thank you because I'm being polite, but if it wasn't them, it was meant to be, God would have helped me another way. But also the other way, if I'm hurt, this person will hurt me, it was meant to be that person I could protect myself from, but it's meant to be. I don't have to be filled with anger because God, if it wasn't decreed by God, it wouldn't have happened to me. I could defend myself, and in the future I could avoid this person, but I have a recognition that no damage happens to me if it wasn't decreed from God, despite human beings' free choice. We can look at the Torah and find it linked in the Torah. I'll take a look at this. I'm going to skip here. We'll go to this idea. Here we go. Joseph to his brothers. He says, they reconcile. And he says to them, don't be distressed about what you've done to me. Don't feel bad. Because it wasn't you who sold me into slavery, it was God. Now they know they sold him into slavery. He says, no, it wasn't you who sent me here, it was God. Why did he send me here? To bring survival to you. Wait, you intended for evil, he says, but God intended for good. In other words, here the brothers are, they sell him into slavery. There is an attempt. So this type of attitude that Joseph has can give you equanimity in this type of trust. If I believe in God, and I believe that God runs the world, and there are meditations and philosophical ideas behind this. I'm just giving you the core takeaway. But if you have that philosophical idea that God runs the world, and God sustains the world, and everything is dependent on God, that means what happens to me happens for a reason. Sometimes I get to see it, sometimes not. Now, these people had moral responsibility for selling Joseph into slavery. That's between them and God. But Joseph is saying, you intended for evil, but God intended for good, which means that I am seeing this as a way to bring survival to everybody. And I'm seeing this as an opportunity from God. I forgive you. You still did a moral wrong and they have to repent to God. I just want to close that and then open up for the questions. But this idea that there are fundamentals of faith, fundamentals of belief that change our attitude and then change our emotions too. I can feel okay with somebody, it was meant to be. There's a famous Yiddish expression, let it be a kapara. Let it be an atonement. The Talmud says, if someone gives you tea, it's not hot enough, or you put your hand in your pocket to take out change and you don't find the right amount, that is atonement in the afterlife. That takes away from suffering in Gehenna, in hell, for any sin that you don't repent before you die. In other words, any suffering in this world is an atonement for the next world if you have the right attitude. In other words, we say in Yiddish, let it be a kapara. Someone fender bender in my car, let it be an atonement. The cow dies, let it be an atonement. What does that mean? And these are little things, of course. These are not the big cosmic suffering we're not dealing with right here. But we're saying in our life, the little things, don't sweat the little things. Doesn't just mean you ignore it. What it means is you say it comes from God. There must be a reason. And yes, I do look for messages of, wait, should I be fixing something in my life? Should I be improving something? But it is seen as everything happening for somehow, either for the good or to correct me in some way, everything happening for a reason. So basically, there's no room for anger in life. So going back to like Maimonides, the idea of anger is one of those things they say stay very far away from, not in the middle of the road. Anger is like idol worship. Why is it like idol worship? Because you believe that somebody else is in control of your destiny. All right. Yes, doctor.
Question related to that. So, but there could be some value to that because, for example, going back to the prophets, they were angry all the time. If you read what's written there. And so the question, I guess, it's not angry about fender bender, but angry about certain things that you think maybe that's the right way of fixing that.
Okay, so first of all, if you look at the 5 books of Moses, when Moses loses his temper once or twice, he's rebuked for it. He ends up once raising the rock and hitting the rock with a stick. That was his temper tantrum in front of whatever it was, to whatever degree. He did something a little bit wrong because of anger. He doesn't go to the land of Israel. There's no room for anger for a prophet. Any prophecy that's anger is from God. So, for example, when a prophet says, I am among the nation of impure lips, and he's talking to God, God sends a prophet to kosher his lip with some hot coals, because the prophet is never allowed to say, and he should never say anything negative about the Jewish people unless God tells him to. So our reading of those biblical texts are God expressing disappointment, but the human being is not supposed to be angry. Now, sometimes in war, we speak of the idea, even with war, not to become lost in an animal. Even our war, we say you should go to war above our enemy. Don't become sucked into a bloodlust or to a blind anger. As a matter of fact, we learn from the story of Moses with the stick and the snake, that the Moses is given a sign, take the stick, throw it down, become a snake. Then he takes it back up, and his staff swallows the snakes of the other people. Why is his staff? Why doesn't the snake? And the idea is that when it comes to taking vengeance, it should be like a stick without the snake bite. So there is this value in Judaism in general. Anger is a loss. Now, there is idea of being angry for God, but not about you. About you, it's idol worship. It's a sense of someone else has the power to harm me. Why am I getting angry? Because someone else did something to me that they shouldn't have done. It was meant to be. God gave me because God is good. And somehow it's for my good. Somehow, I don't know how. Anger, in other words, is not a positive emotion in general. In philosophical thought, in Jewish ethics, we don't find much room for it. Ego, gava, a little bit. 1/60th of Sheminis Sheminis, 1/64th, whatever that is, 1/8 of an eighth of ego. One is allowed to have. Ego also is not considered, in other words, to be hubris. Very humble, but not as much as anger avoided. Anger is really something to be avoided. It's a loss, the loss of self. It's a belief that somehow something else is running the world. Again, this is a conversation much deeper, but this is like the idea of ethics. And you can read the back. There's a selection from Ethics of Our Fathers, which has a bunch of different aphorisms that are relevant to this conversation about within the letter of the law. But like anger is like one of those like character traits that is very natural, but a lot of it does have to do with how you're raised and what you see growing up, and also a belief system too. In other words, there is temperament, there is personality, there is environment, but we believe a belief system can modify. It's hard to know because some people, hey, by temperament, you don't care much. By temperament, you're not a person who gets who gets angry. So one could argue that, but for sure there is this value system of working towards it, like anger being something that we can control by a belief system. If it's deliberate, if you want to act angry, that's what Jewish law says. Before you spank your kid, the corporal punishment is not forbidden in Jewish law. but it shouldn't be done out of anger. It should be done, I'm not angry. Now, I just want to show you that I'm going to show you that this is something that's disappointing. I can pretend to be angry if you feel it might make people, but you shouldn't lose yourself. You can pretend to be angry, but you got to be honest with yourself. We're not always honest. Oh, I'm just pretending. No, you're not. You have bloodshot eyes, you have smoke coming out of your nose, but it is a big faith. In other words, faith means that you believe that no one could harm me unless or do anything against my that hurts me. That's not meant to be. One can be disappointed in people, but anger is not the proper emotion in Jewish thought. I'm not sure if every psychiatrist would agree with that. I'm saying for Judaism, it is something we avoid to the nth degree, not the middle of the road. Any other thoughts? Yes. So we're done. It's 8:30. Whoever has to go is free.
The question, the usual question with philosophers and so on, this case of Spinoza. Can you comment on that?
Yes, Spinoza. He's still. It's the issue like this. Spinoza, 1700s. He's in Amsterdam. All these Moranos have come out. He's right, but also the environment had been such that the people who had come out were not that enamored with rabbinic Judaism. They didn't know it. They knew the book of Esther about hiding as a Marano. They knew that. They knew some biblical stuff. So there is this whole intellectual battles going on about people not feeling comfortable in Judaism. But I would say, if you say, let reason take me where I can to its nth degree, which means I can come to conclusions that I'm not moored and held on by Jewish thought. So the idea of him being put in excommunication, though, if you look at what's going on, Maimonides was put in excommunication. He was a much greater scholar than Spinoza. He was a much greater leader. These people, this was going on. This was an old battle. And this was a battle of it wasn't about philosophy per se. It was about heretical philosophy with Spinoza. In other words, it was a different, I'm not comparing the two. I'm saying he took it to the degree where basically he disconnects it from revelation and he puts God into nature, which in truth, by the way, if he would have encountered Hasidism and their understanding of the mystical and the philosophical, pantheism doesn't have to be foreign to Judaism. We could call it panentheism, which is Gott is Alts and Alts is Gott, the belief that God is in all things, but he's also transcendent. Spinoza's philosophy that the nature is the sum total of God, and there is no supernatural God, so to speak, is where he goes off. So, on one foot, Spinoza, this idea of bans in the modern age rings hollow to us. We don't understand. It was the only tool that a powerless people had about anything. You couldn't do anything to anybody except push them out of the community. And at a certain point, you're poisoning the well. And we can't have you as part of it. We saw, even with kosher philosophy, the challenges that were taking place. Forget about trace philosophy. No, I'm sorry. You don't get to stay in the pool and do your business and then muddy the water. It's time to out of the pool. This is our pool. So this excommunication, from a traditional point of view, makes a lot of sense. It was the only tool they had. On the other hand, in our world today, excommunication means nothing. I'll go somewhere else. I don't need you. But in the ancient world, and you're not that ancient, there was no real community of free thinkers. You were either Jewish or Christian, or Jewish or Islamic. There was no such a thing until emancipation. You don't really have, that's just happening at that same time period, where you could be a Jew who is an atheist or someone of Jewish descent, and you have your own identity. Doesn't exist before that, so it's just happening with Napoleon, so a little bit later, it doesn't have it. So in other words, all you have to do is, so being outside is a real threat. And it is somehow, it bolsters and saves the community, they would think. Otherwise, it's a snowball. You can't, if there are no rules, what's going to be? So, but nowadays, bans have very little effect. And it's a big challenge. There is no coercive power to the Jewish community.